towards you. Thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate it. So Jim noted that I'm talking about digital pedagogy, but I wanted to sort of put a spin on that. We often think about our research influencing our teaching, and what I want to talk about today is our teaching influencing our research, but I want to talk about that from a sort of educational theory perspective, and I want to do it with student work. Partly because the clinical part of my clinical appointment at IU is advising in the department on digital pedagogy approaches. And one of the approaches that I've taken to that is that if we're going to do digital pedagogy, we should really understand what the learning outcomes students are getting from it, so we're not just saying, it's super fun and they get more engaged. Well, how do we know? So that's one of the things that this team is doing, and I will also point out that it is a set of teams. This is not just my work, although the initial impetus for it was in my classrooms. The NetCreate team are 4 faculty at IU, variously spread across the School of Education and the Indiana University Network Science Institute. And the IDA team has also been immensely important to developing this work, because we take this into the classrooms, and it's the IDA team that supports the classroom use, that helps us figure out what we want to study with the students, that helps us figure out how to mod the tool. So, like any good historian, we start with history and dates. This has been through a number of different iterations, from the sort of sketchy version of Latin semantic extraction that I did for my own work early on when I was just sort of in the last couple of years of grad school, to a Google form that was the first encounter I had my students doing with network analysis. The NetCreate tool that I want to talk about in its 2018 and 2019 version today has gone through 5 or 6 different iterations, and it's gone through those iterations moving back and forth between a research environment where someone wants to answer specific questions about a historical period, and a teaching environment where what we're really trying to get students to do is understand how to read a historical text. And that has implications for the ways that we've developed the tool. Both of those worlds are contributing. So let's talk about the 2018-2019 version. What it looks like. And I will go to the network in just a minute and show you what students produced. In 2 75-minute sessions, we give students a text they've never read before. In the case I'm going to show you today, it's Tacitus's Annals of the Late Roman Imperial Court. Nero, who burned Rome down, and Claudius, his stepdad, and Agrippina, his mom. We take the entirety of that chunk of text, it's about 150 pages, and we divide it across 25 student groups, so that each student group has expertise in one small chunk, but that then they can see how all of the other people in the class with their chunks contribute to a large framework. And the idea here is that most of us in our disciplines have a framework. We know where to put the details, and we can identify the significant ones because we already know what's going to happen. Students don't have that. So it's a chicken-egg problem. How do we get them to develop the details and the framework so that they know which details to remember and mark? On day 2, they come back and they get a different extract that has already been entered, and then they have to revise it. So here we're teaching historiography and the academic conversation. So that, again, they're getting a sense of expertise. We forced them to read 6 pages out of the 150 that were assigned, and we know that they had to do it because they had to enter the data. So we're also getting students to read. It's a little sneaky, but it works. And the end result is, I've got to look behind me and find my mouse. This is the original networks that students produced. And when it loads, one of the things I'm going to do is sort of zoom in and out and play with people.
No.
This is what the students do. But the thing is that the students are seeing, as somebody else enters a new node, the node pops up immediately on all of the screens in the classroom. Simultaneous data entry is a really key piece of getting that detailed framework interaction to happen in only 150 minutes. But so is this idea of play. The fact that you can see how far Claudius drags bits and pieces of the network, which gives you a sense of how important it is, but also shows you that Agrippina stops some people from moving. That's actually part of the historical record. Agrippina has her own court, and they're not influenced by Claudius. And you get that from play, but that means that our play is based in stats. We're basing it in the evidence the students gather from the text. The other thing we were able to do with this, and this is something that our, back to that team thing, our Network Institute person was like, I don't know who's the dude and who's not. How do I know that in classical Latin? We had initially planned to have the students do entry by gender. because one of the things that the instructor who nicely hosted us in his class, Colin Elliott, wanted his students to see is how women are depicted in Tacitus. Only one of these nodes is really big. That means only one of these nodes has lots and lots of connections. But there are a whole bunch of nodes that are very little that connect very big nodes. Eigenvector centrality. So we're getting students to learn eigenvector centrality. And what we want them to see is that women aren't important unless Tacitus wants them to be. But if you take the women out, it breaks the court by generation. Women hold the court generations together in the Roman imperial network. We wanted them to see that, and that's how we got there. But we had to do it very quickly. This is all live, this is all in 2 75-minute class sessions. So the students out with this, Colin talked them through the basics of what they saw in the network. They talked about how important Claudius was. They talked about the fact that the Senate, which they assumed would be important, kinda isn't. We were able to break some of their preconceived notions about the Roman imperial networks. And while Colin was explaining this, I was frantically in the back corner taking the export that we did in this tool, changing some of the parameters around it, and in 2 minutes, getting a network that had gender. And that's also a key piece of this, is that the software has to be adaptable so that we can do stuff in classrooms with students live to change their perception of the history we're asking them to engage with. They also have access to all the data. So here's the nodes table, events, men and women, significance. They're actually tracking and taking notes on this. They have an edges table that has citations. I talked about the historiographic practices of scholars. This forces them to engage in historiographic practices because they know exactly where the citation came from, and they can argue whether or not they agree with what the previous group did, and we have that on tape. Students who normally don't say, how do we know? Saying, how do we know? Because they're sitting in an activity with a tool that supports them with a specific call to action that is fun to play with. And therefore, how do we know becomes part of this play. So let's hop back to PowerPoint. Oh, of course. Look, I'm a digital historian. Okay, here we go. So let's talk about how we got there. One of the things that we wanted to see and understand was whether or not lots and lots of interaction with the network made a difference. That is, does engagement with the network on a regular basis, even if they're not engaging particularly deeply with one node, give them information or a better understanding of the historical context that we're asking them to recreate? We asked them to write a paper that talks about the importance of Agrippina in the royal court, and we tracked how many of them came back after class between when they had produced the network and when they had to hand in the paper 14 days later to look at the network. How many nodes they interacted with, how many edges they looked at, what kinds of things they did in their spare time. And it turns out quantity is important, but not as important as a qualitative discussion on day 2 when they're revising the edges. Students who attempted to recreate accurate context in their papers did engage with the network fairly heavily, more heavily than their peers who did not attempt to recreate accurately the historical context. Students who were actually accurate engaged in both quantitative terms, and the video that we have of them doing revisions was much more detailed, had many more, well, how did they get there, questions of the classmates' previous entries. So we know that the in-class activity has a significant impact on how they use the network, but we also know that the network has a significant impact on their engagement with the assignment at hand. It's not perfect. All of our great students are going to do that, but the middle students in that sort of B+ range are going to get better at this because we've given them something different, a detailed framework approach that looks different than us just asking them to read, take notes, and then read again. Which comes back to the question of how network tools support us. How do network tools support digital humanities folks? There are a whole boatload of studies out there in the IST world, in the human-computer interaction world, that give us answers to these questions. And as digital humanists, because a lot of these sit in the world of educational theory or psychology, we forget that they're there. So I want to highlight a couple of these, and I've got a couple of digital humanities folks who have addressed some of those questions from a more practical perspective. With Latour, tools aren't just tools. Tools are never our goals. They're not methods either, they're research scaffolds, and they change what we gather and how we gather. We saw that with the students behaving on day 2, by using the prompts from a network entry that somebody else had put in to guide their own approach to the text. Vygotsky, tools are just part of a system and people are the biggest parts of that system. How do tools mediate the social interactions between people? An important question because that's where we saw the biggest gains, were in the social interactions that were mediated by the tool on revision day. And then we've also got some practical needs. Scott Weingart talks about 8 features, account for unbiased or incomplete data, support temporal networks. I'm drawing some random stuff out of his list of 11 or 12 features. Immediate feedback, visualization at the same time as data entry. This is the top of his list because that's what gives us a sense of what we're entering and gives us a sense of what to ask next. So NetCreate takes some of these kinds of theoretical underpinnings and the practical needs that we have as a community and puts them into a systematic structure that gives us access to both the mediation theory, the idea of the goal as the primary focus, but through a tool that meets many of our needs as a community. And it's particularly focused on that classroom context because we don't often think about network analysis as a collaborative thing where many people are entering data at the same time. Turns out, though, that's really important. There are a couple of, then, historical theories. We want to talk about historical argumentation, and we also need to think about the idea of CAPTA. I'm going to talk about the bolded ones in just a minute, but the educational theories that help us plan the actual tool features are drawn from Vygotsky and adaptations of Vygotsky in the modern world called activity theory. We're working with computer-supported collaborative learning folks, and we're thinking about design-based research, which is iterative. So let's start with the history side. And this is one of the things the American Historical Association has really, really been strongly in favor of lately, is that data are research outputs. CAPTA is a better word for it then, because it's what we extract from our text. And there's an interpretive layer to that the students experience as they are taking information from an open prose text and turning it into structured data. That is those tables that I showed you. Activity theory gives us a way of handling the system of people and things that work together to get us to our goal. And the key piece here is that when the students walk into the classroom, their assumption is that we want them to memorize names, dates, and faces. Network analysis does a really good job of showing them names, dates, and faces, but it gets them to our objective, which is to make arguments with those names, dates, and faces as evidence. So by using a tool that supports what they think they're going to get, but pushes them to do what we want them to get, we are moving their object of activity to match ours more closely and using the system, the people in it, and the tool as part of that movement structure. Computer-supported collaborative learning is what showed us that we could get detail and framework at the same time, that by dividing and conquering, using some distributed cognition across the whole of a text, but making these parts for each small group approachable and manageable, that we could actually do this in a limited amount of time in the classroom. And then design-based research gave us iteration, contextual research, and the integration of these kinds of things into our classroom. And of course, this takes all of those people that I talked about at the beginning. So here are the pieces of the NetCreate tool that give us that. And on this side of the room, there's a couple of little text pieces over here that I'll point to. We've got integrated visual and textual scaffolding. The viz plus the edges and tables plus the entry form, so that you can see everybody's work at both of those small group, large classroom levels. Easily accessible citations and notes exposing the narrative-based structure of the network the students are creating, so they don't see it as given, they see it as taken, as interpreted. And the play that exposes very important statistical values in the network that they have generated, so that our play is based in a curricular practice that matches both the digital and the humanities part of our work. So that brings us to, that is probably me getting email.
No, it's me. Sorry.
Oh, thank God. I thought I had turned on my speaker. So that leads us to the very last line on this. And I've put the dark stuff, that's the research stuff. We're at the research stage. And I did what many of us do in this room, I hope. Or I'm about to out myself if I don't. I forgot that I had a paper to give at a conference. So 4 days in advance, remembering that I had that paper to give at a conference that I promised something very specific for, I realized I had a tool that could help. I had talked about networks and bishops. I just didn't have any bishops in a network yet. So my work is on the 5th through the 11th centuries. One of the sort of central core anchor to that is a guy named Agnellus, who writes a serial Lives of Bishops in 9th century Ravenna. Serial lives start at the very beginning of a see, usually with imagined stories that tie the first bishop of that see to Paul or Peter or one of the apostles. In this case, it's to Peter. And then gives you this unbroken line of bishops all the way to the present, usually because there's a conflict in the present that needs some kind of shoring up, either intellectually, emotionally, or otherwise, so that then the written lives of bishops become part of the public action that's happening around this conflict. What I wanted to know was how we were thinking about place in this life, because one of the things people talk about in the historiography of this particular text, the Liber Pontificalis Ravenatus, is that Annales is the first architectural historian. Place matters. But what we don't often talk about is the question about place mattering when you think about how he presents this text, which is delivered to you as I'm delivering it, live in person with people following him around the city, skittering behind him as he points out monuments. There's an argument about whether or not he did that or he just wrote it, and nobody's been able to solve the argument, and that was what I wanted to explore. So I took the English translation of the text and ran it through Stanford's named entity recognition program, because we know from student behavior, and my GA and my Max talked about this, we know from student behavior that it's not the node entry that makes the research. We learned that about 3 weeks before we made this network. So we said, we don't need to learn anything from the node entry, let's just extract it. What we did do was do the edge entry by hand, because it was the conversations about the edge entry in the classroom that had given the students the insights. And it wasn't just the overall edge entry at the end, it was the edge by edge conversation about how we were going to scope things, what made an edge a particular kind of edge, and how we were going to talk about the significance.
Could you say a little something about nodes and edges real quick?
So nodes are the little circles. Nodes are the nouns in a network, the lines between them. The nodes get bigger as there are more connections, more lines between nodes. Lines between them are edges. These are the verbs in a network. I visited Ball State. Ball State is a node. I'm a node. There's now an edge between us. So these edges here, they get really thick. Unsurprisingly, this is Ravenna. This is the guy who wrote the text. But what we found ourselves doing was meta-analyzing the conversations we were having according to the coding schema that we had used to analyze student learning. And it was in one of those conversations that we looked at the ways that place tied all of the different generations of bishops together, that we realized this is the Rick Steves of the 9th century Ravenna. It's a guidebook. It's not an oral historian trailing around with a bunch of people behind him. So we think based on the ways that place functions in this network, that it wasn't ever delivered orally, even though that's his claim to Lady Macbeth fame. He's saying it too many times and taken sort of implicitly with the ways that he talks about place and the ways that those green nodes, which are all place-based, tie many things together. If you took them out, this network breaks into about 25 different bits. Separate networks that no longer connect. That the place was part of his goal of getting people to wander around in Ravenna and look at these places in his contemporary period, because Charlemagne was stealing them all away. And Charlemagne's kids had come back to enact spolia on Ravenna several times in the 40 years between 800 and 840 when this was written. So, one of the things that I want to do with this is think about more and more structured interventions in my classroom, not just with networks, but with mapping, with text analysis, so that we can take some of those underpinnings and bring them back into our research teams. If we can get this kind of work from 4 days of 2 people talking to each other with exposure to this kind of systematic learning outcome approach applied to the way that we do professional research, what might we do with the rest of our work? What might that give us as a community to make some of the systematic choices we make about engaging with text, with maps, with networks in particular ways, and in extracting data from our sources as CAPTA that will make us better researchers, more honest, and easier, more readily willing and able to show our work. I will note here that this is funded by the NSF EAGER program, so it's a little odd for humanities stuff like this to get NSF funding. That has been a big part of our approach to the systematic learning piece. We're in the middle of trying to get this releasable in a form that you can put up that has an export button so you can get stuff out of this into Gephi. Because Gephi is a very powerful part of the network analysis world. It gives us factions. Netcrete can't do that. It gives us a whole bunch of other statistics that NetCreate is not set up to do because it's got very particular purposes for existing, and the simultaneous data entry is a big piece of it. But I also want to give you a chance to A, ask questions, and B, play with the tool. We have a half an hour left. I have a demo version of this up and ready for you to enter your own names into. But I want to open the floor to questions first before we go play with it, because my guess is that you just won't want to stop playing once we do that. So, questions about what I've talked about so far? Yeah.
A comment and a question. The comment is, my gosh, I can see how this could apply to Lady Murasaki Shikibu and a number of the ladies in waiting at the Japanese hand court, because we have indications that they were nodes that connected networks at the court, but to then be able to do this graphically might be very useful, comparable to what you were doing with Tacitus. And the second thing is a question, whether you have any assessment or ideas concerning Seshat. They recently did that article in Nature, and there's been debate back and forth, among other things, that their conclusions weren't that earth-shattering, because they basically say that that complex societies with roads and the like can precede moralizing gods, and that moralizing gods may only be tacked on then as protections against freeloaders. But they're arguing against this tradition that you build these big empires with moralizing gods. Do you think that sometimes people may look at the initial conclusions and say, so what? Because qualitative analysis already got there, but what's your assessment, or if you know about the Seshat global data?
I've looked at it briefly. Ultimately, I think the answer comes in the fact that digital humanities is a phrase, not two separate words. So the example with Anyelis, what we've added is another 20% onto a conversation that's been happening for years. We never, ever, ever, ever in any article get 100% away from what the previous generation talks about. If an average article without digital methods confirms 80% of what we already knew in the lit review, and then the 20% that we add on is good enough. This is 20%.
Yeah.
It's maybe a little more than 20%. So I think the value there is not necessarily that we want to, again, accept these networks at face value and say the world has changed. I think the value in it is that we're questioning what we already know and moving it forward, and that's not anything unusual for the academy. Yeah. So how do we take the Shefet article and think more carefully and more subtly about it, as opposed to saying, well, these tools are everything, but they're never going to matter. Maybe they matter 20%, and that's okay.
Full disclosure, I work with Session.
Yeah.
So I'm very much in favor of this sort of stuff, but we do receive these sorts of complaints.
Yeah, and I think that that's the key. And that's, again, part of the idea that we bring back from the undergraduate classroom and their learning outcomes, is that now we can talk about how we got there. Yeah. And we have learning data from other human beings who are assessing these kinds of networks in the same ways and talking about them. The ways that we have a little bit more subtlety and a little bit more skill than they do, but we know that that still matters to us, that the ways that the students are behaving can improve our work. And maybe we get 25% more new data out of one of these. Thanks. But that's the best we can do. Yeah.
Can you talk us a little bit more about what's going on in those three-person student groups?
Yeah.
And also, I'm interested in specifically the debate that happens in the second round.
Sure. Okay, so I've got two examples, one of them from day one, and I'll sort of scaffold that by talking about what the students do. So the students get 3 copied pages. They've never seen the text before. We give them a background. They've gotten a 75-minute standard lecture from my colleague on what the late Roman Empire is like. Particularly, they get the sort of 3rd century crisis, everything's blowing out, sort of lecture. And then they get this text in which there is sex, drugs, rock and roll, or at least the equivalent thereof for the late Roman Empire. and his concern is that they just lose names and dates and faces. So the first day, literally them going, I'm sorry, what is this guy's name? Wasn't there a guy named that 2 pages ago in our reading and it's a different guy? Ugh. But they would do that at home anyway. So the example from day one of what follows that is, somebody already created that node. Let's go use it, because I don't want to do any work. We literally have students on camera saying this. I don't want to do any work. So they click on the node, and then what you watch them do, because we've got screen captures that go with the audio and the video, so we can see what they're doing on the screen as they're complaining about how stupid this tool is that they click on it, and they go, oh, somebody already made that edge. Well, why? Isn't that a different guy? No, that is a different guy than on page 3. And all of a sudden now, these 3 students Two of them are buried in their books, or the copy pages. One of them on one page, one of them on the first page, where you've got those two ambiguous names, which is really common in these old Roman texts, trying to figure out if that edge that they saw next to the node that was already created, because they wanted to use it, because they didn't want to do any work, actually matter. So that's what day one looks like. Day one is a lot of eye rolling in the first 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden, they start to realize, as other nodes pop up from other student groups, that they're being helped. And that makes a difference. On day two, it flips the script. On day two, what you see, and the example is from one set of students who were complaining about how bad the note-taking was from the students who entered the data for the section they've got, because they're switching excerpts now. They didn't even put in a page number. Where did this come from? Let's go find that page number. How many times do your students say, let's go find that page number? Yeah, okay, so I was just as surprised as you were. I mean, I expected some positive reaction, but my experience with other versions of this activity, without the simultaneous visualization plus data entry, is that day two is a dud. We have video from a year earlier of students using a text-only tabular version. Do I have it? I might have it. Yes, here's the text-only tabular version that students used the year before. Boring. Node entry day is great. The first data entry day, they're like, all right, this kind of makes sense. Let's go see who's already input. So we see the who's already there that we can use from this tool to the NetCreate tool. But what we don't see is the excitement about the revision. And that's the experience on day two, is that they are more engaged. They are more likely to engage quickly without us coming around to prod and say, so how's it going? Because they have an active set of toolkits that they can use that expose this data but also give them that play. Like, who can we drag that we think in our sector of pages needs more attention? This person is too small based on the scheme that we just did. Let's make them bigger. What did the other team miss? So the element of historiography really comes into play because of that combined data set and visualization and the accessibility of both and the immediacy of both.
Good, thank you.
I'll go you and then you.
Okay.
All right.
So I was wondering, and it kind of came back up when you showed the text version versus the infographic sort of version. And I think you kind of spoke to this, but I'd like to hear more maybe. Do you, when you're assessing students' learning in this process, do you consider like the particular like modes of engagement that they go through, so they're entering text versus more manipulating pre-existing sorts of things, as separate kind of units within your assessment and assess them separately, or do you sort of put the whole activity together and think about it together?
Both.
Okay.
I think both are important. So the one of the things that we want to know is how different behaviors affect the end outcome. So Leah Shopko at IUB does a lot of work on this, and it is that the essay is a black box. You never know in which of the 18 steps it takes to get a reasonable essay, the student is running into barriers. So we want an essay, because this is what many of our colleagues are giving out and what they expect. We want to know where the barriers and where the affordances are for an activity like this, which means we want to look at the holistic. But what we did to assess the individual, we had two separate sets of coding schema. How often did the students either use implicit vocabulary or explicit vocabulary drawn from the tutorials that we gave them? And then we combined them, so that we had assessments of each individual step and each individual skill that were done by separate people, so we weren't mixing the two up. And that's where we started to look at what individual behaviors. Node entry is important, but only for attempts to recreate context. Edge entry and discussion is vital for accuracy. That's where we want our students to focus. So we're going to do this with my digital history class in about 2 weeks. And because of that, we are not asking them to do node entry. We are going to do a Stanford name entity extraction of the secondary source that they're reading. So you can do this with long primary sources or secondary sources. It's great for getting students to extract argument and historical narrative writing. We're going to do it with a secondary source, but we're pulling all the names out. It's just going to be a big giant blob of unconnected circles with labels, because the edge entry is where we want to focus their energy. So that's how we got to some of those sort of distinctions, and we chose to do it because we wanted to understand how those distinctions mattered for the standard assignment we give, where we often can't break those down. You had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could talk a bit more about the benefits of NetCreate as a tool in general, in comparison with other network analysis tools like Gephi.
Yeah, sure. So Gephi sucks to learn, and it's super powerful, and that's a problem.
Sure.
You have to know what you're doing. You have to understand where all the buttons are. You have to know that if it crashes in a specific way, you need to shut it all the way down and reopen it. Sometimes you need to shut your computer down and reopen it. That's a barrier to entry for many of these sort of novice pieces. But what we also wanted was a tool that would allow people to take information out of this and put it into Gephi. Because, as my GA and I realized for this project, this was faster than any of the other tools that we had. It was much faster for us to just have a whole bunch of and you can see some of the remnants of the disconnected nodes out here. These are things we never connected because we had agreed that they were erroneous input from the named entity recognition, or that they weren't significant in the schema that we had developed, or there were a number of different reasons that we didn't connect those. It was faster for us. It took us about 4 hours with lives of approximately 65 bishops to make this network. And again, given my 4-day deadline, I could have chosen a number of different ways to do this. This was the fastest, and that's important.
That's great. That's excellent. We have we're going to be bringing in a digital scholarship strategist to the library to do a lot of professional work working with faculty and students, and I'm trying to think about what tools to help steer them towards, and so this is incredibly helpful.
So the other thing I would say there, and I told Doug that I do this, and I think Tara, when I teach undergrads, we did this in a workshop that was designed for faculty and graduate students who had never encountered digital tools before. We use Post-it notes and blackboards and whiteboards. In part because, and here the barrier to entry isn't low, but the barrier to entry for a lot of other textual analysis or mapping tools can be a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
We don't want to teach people where the thing is in one program, because then they'll be stuck with that program forever. We want the first encounter to be with something that is either transparent enough that they can look for that thing in another package, or that they understand the basics and they know that they need to search for it. Post-it notes do a really great job of getting past that, where was that thing in the file menu, teaching the digital method, and also showing people how computational versions of that are different than human versions. So if you do a word cloud, people are going to combine digital humanities because we're pattern makers. So if you do a word cloud about debates in the digital humanities, and digital humanities ends up being really big on a whiteboard written word cloud, that's not what it's going to look like when Voyant does it. It'll be digital and humanities. That's a teaching tool. That's a gap filler. That helps us make that point that Latour makes, which is that tools aren't just tools. They mediate for us, and we need to understand what they do. And that's true of networks too.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Build on that question. The other question is, it sounds like, and maybe this is a question that goes back, I've met you before, I'm forgetting
Mike.
your name, Mike, about bringing in people to help. Is it, because it sounds like as you implemented it in this classroom, there are a lot of people behind it. Helping with the network grading, helping with the content, helping with this, you doing the work as the students are doing the work so that they can see the changes. Because I'm just wondering what sort of ways we then implement that in, say, my survey class where I'm the only one there and I have 4 other classes or whatever, and I'm trying to kind of figure out those things. Maybe as part of your answering the question might partially bring in people to help. But I'm just trying to take it from like that to then
on the ground. So I have 2 answers for that. One is when I don't have a team of people with cameras with me. It's just me in a 96-person classroom, and I do this. In part because I find that once I have figured out what the problem with any given reading I have is, I probably already have an activity structured for it, and that makes it makes the first year of classroom planning a big giant nightmare as I figure out what works, right? But now I have enough experience and I know what works. I have little drop-in activities, Post-it notes for this particular text, because nobody figures out what the connections are, and I can make those connections for students really quickly. So that's the first answer, is that I do this by myself in my classrooms all the time. The second answer is that at IDA, we have 2 GAs. Our GAs are, they're consultants, and they offer in-classroom help. And our goal is to teach people how to do this with the Post-it notes the first time on their own, so they feel like they can do it with Post-it notes on their own further along. That becomes something they do not just in that one classroom when we visit. It becomes something they can use in every class going forward ever. But we also want to offer support for things like this. And we have a faculty fellowship that is designed on campus to get people better at this, so that eventually we are not the only resource, and we are not the only people who can enact it in our classrooms. And I think not to diminish the sort of personal need to do this on the ground, but it's a systemic issue, not a personal one in many ways.
No, and that's what I'm kind of talking about
Yeah.
too, and that's what I was saying, like,
And
with
that's-
bringing people in is, because I do things like this in my classroom already, but
Right.
they're different, and I do story maps, I do digital timelines, I do all these sorts of things, but it's just incorporating them in ways that would then rely on support from the institution. That's bigger than just, I'm gonna do this in my class, right, so this happens.
Exactly. And that's part of the oddity of my position in the department, in the history department. I was initially brought in to do exactly that, because we have a number of really great pedagogues in the department who have been arguing for years that it is important for us to do evidence-based classroom activities that get students involved in being historians, not in listening to historians tell stories. And that position, because of the kinds of impact it had on the department, we have 12 people doing this kind of stuff on their own in the department out of 55 or 60, which is pretty good. And many of whom are like, I hate computers. I say that, but I joke about it. Many of them really mean it, and they still take this kind of stuff into their classroom because they find that it works. And that was where the impetus for the Institute for Digital Arts and Humanities becoming partially pedagogy bound, because we were able to make the argument with our vice provost of research that pedagogy is the foot in the door to the research. People will be less scared of it if they see their students engaging with it and engaging well. And that has been our experience. We've got a couple of folks in whose classrooms we went 3 or 4 years ago who are faculty fellows or are doing summer incubators with us now.
That's a great point. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
You want to play with it?
Yeah.
Sure.
Let's play with it. Okay, so you need computers, obviously. This is a forward. So I will also say that I've been sort of talking to Doug and Jim about tracking people who are doing digital humanities in Indiana. So that's what this network is. It is a network of people doing digital humanities in Indiana. So let me demonstrate, because I've handily left myself off of this. I will write the URL up here so that I can. And it is case sensitive, as usual. Let me hop over to my other screen. And it'll look like this. So here's us, I'm here, unconnected, because the networks I put in are my IDA network here, and then a Create Research team. So here I can type. This is one of the things that we did. We set up pre-filled text. So if you type a couple of letters, you'll get a list of the things that match that. This is one of the things we did to scaffold students with all those stupid Roman names. When I say stupid, lovingly. I'm not in here yet. How am I not in here? Let's add me. So I will type my name and I'll put add new node. Click here, I'll put it down below. Oh, hold on. I might have to refresh this thing. This is the problem with prototype software. It sometimes behaves badly. There we go. I'm a person. I'm going to capitalize my name properly and spell it properly. I'm not going to add any significance. I left room here for geocodes and dates because you can export to Gephi and then you can geocode this or run it temporally. I'm going to hit save. Hey, look, here I am. I'm going to add a new edge. I visited Ball State. Here we go. You can change targets, so you can flip the order. This means you can choose directional or bidirectional edges. The date was 2019, 09, 18. So again, here we're thinking about sorting. I've got this in standard computer date terms over here. Save. Hey, I'm connected now. But I should also be connected to IDA. I interact with IDA. There we go. Save. Hey, look at that. Are you a part of the DH community in Indiana? Probably. You're here. Go ahead and add yourself. Yeah. And I will come around and do some support, so if you have problems, let me know. So click add a new node. Yeah, like you. Yeah.
What's the date format?
It's year, dash, month, dash, day. They're sort of reverse computer ordering. And you can do it on the phone. We actually, so for students who don't have their own devices, we bring Chromebooks or iPads. And that way we're not dealing with a sort of equitable issue where some students have tech and some don't. Okay, so now scroll down on the left-hand side and add a new edge for yourself. And if you scroll down, you'll get the edge options. How's yours going? So you can, there you go. And you can see all of the other things people are adding popping up around the left-hand side. This is what the student experience is like. If you all connect yourself to the Digital Scholarship Lab, you'll see it, the node for the Digital Scholarship Lab getting increasingly large.
And you can also, between each other, or?
You can also make connections between other people. This is totally open. So one of the things that I'll point out is that the node and edge types are driven by a template, so we can change taxonomies. That's a really key piece of being able to move from the late antique Roman world to the medieval world to the modern world. Not all of the interactions are going to be the same. I sort of guessed at what we might use here, but we could change this if we wanted to.
Oh, fun.
Yes, so now you're beginning to see what the students see. And they're like,
Yeah.
oh, cool, I just saw that other thing pop up. We were just talking about that. There are a couple of problems here. One of them is that if two people enter two nodes with exactly the same thing at the same time, I have to delete them. I have admin privileges. I've given you admin privileges because deletion can sometimes be necessary. This only runs right now on a Mac server. What's your question?
Oh, I was just wondering if you do multiple associations at once.
You can't do multiple associations at once. So if one person is associated with many things already in the network, you do them one by one. But what that does is augment edge weight and augment node size.
This might be a complex question, but how easy is it to export this and save it to the web?
So actually, that's really easy.
Okay.
Let me show you. So this, you see this standalone title up here? Our developers built up there. This is on the NetCreate page. It's one of the student sample networks.
Okay.
Our developers built an export tool that gives you read access and drag access, but no edit access.
Okay.
So if you want to display a network created in NetCreate, it's just a bunch of files that can be uploaded to an FTP server.
Okay.
And it does still expose all of the nodes and edges. It gives you all of the sorting so that you can still see the different ways that people have categorized their data.
Okay.
The goal was, and it does, we've got it in a JSON file format
Okay.
as underlying data, so you can export that to Gephi.
Okay.
And we've done that. The sample I have for the Gephi export and re-import, we wanted students to see factions. So, takes a minute to load, here we go. These are the Gephi analyzed factions, according to the data the students put in, that the Roman imperial court would have hewed to.
Okay.
And this was one of the things we gave them access to as they were thinking about who hangs out with whom. We exported the data out. I did this live in the class too. We exported the data out, we ran it through a quick Python script that took all of the data from JSON format into Gephi's tabular CSV data. I ran factions, and then we re-imported it into NetCreate's JSON format and showed them live all of the different things so that we could talk about what factions were, because we wanted to send them home with something akin to a real live network analysis education. It's not the sort of stuff that gives them access to, well, what does 0.5 mean when it comes to centrality? They won't have numbers associated with those importances, but they'll have visual weight associated with it and color.
That's really, really cool. Thank you for sharing.
So we do have a concept map. I can show you it. In the technical phrase. If I can spell. So our educational research partners took this to a conference in Lyon. Computer-supported collaborative learning. The green are people. The blue are theories or ideas. These little purple things are publications. So this is essentially bibliometrics for the learning sciences community that uses computer-supported learning in the classroom. And one of the things that happened, the reason this network exists, we had to, because of the size of the classroom in which we took our NetCreate data this spring, we had to bring in extra people. So we brought in all the grad students from the Learning Sciences program at IU. And as they were watching students fill this out, they were sort of sitting in the back corner whispering. And one of us went up to them to ask what they were whispering about, and they said, "Can we use this to study for quals?" This is a quals study network that we turned into a conference presentation.
This is terrific.
Yeah,
Thank
gives you a good sense of it.
Yeah, well, so that was the goal, was to give you guys the chance to actually play with it.
In the field, in the significance field,
Yeah.
how elaborate do you want to get?
Well, so that varies by activity. The question isn't how elaborate should it be, the question is how elaborate do you need it to be for what you're doing with it right now. We don't need anything for this, right? I just put in a couple of pointers for like Michelle or Anne McCraney because not all of you know who those people are. And if I leave and you still have access to this network, I want you to know who they are.
Right.
For the students, what we gave them were two specific guidances. One on the nodes, which was if there's an ambiguous relationship, like we've got a couple of Suetoniuses floating around in Tacitus, which one is it? And if there's more of the information, so they liked adding salacious stuff. They liked adding little stories, the fun things that you hear at a community history museum. They added stuff like that. But the edge significance, what we wanted from them, and we gave them specific guidance, is that we wanted them to talk about why that interaction happened. Because that's what gives them essentially the Cliff's Notes for going back and looking at this later as a guide to understanding what's happening. So here you can see the indiscrete relationship as a pretext to remove Lucius Silanus from his role in the imperial court. We wanted them to have that why, so that we're pushing them constantly to think about historical argumentation in the significance field.
Do you know, is anybody using this for mapping out the Salem witch trials?
No one's using this. I mean, that's not no one.
Or I mean, anything like.
I haven't seen anything like it. No.
I don't recall seeing anything either.
There are, anything you've got where you're looking at individual interactions that aggregate into larger patterns.
Right.
Any network analysis tool will work. The question is, has somebody with a comfort level that allows them to use Gephi and to deal with all of its, how do I zoom back in again? Questions, that's the real barrier.
Or Palladio, you have to have.
Palladio, you
all
have to
the
have it
stuff.
downloaded,
Sort of
uploaded,
intermediate.
downloaded.
Yeah.
I mean, just seeing things pop up on here while I'm
Yes.
doing my thing that's the killer
Yeah.
part of this. I
This
think.
is what makes it possible for network collaboration.
Yeah.
There's no
Right.
tool out there that makes collaboration in a network possible. The end.
Right.
We needed that.
Well, the reason I was asking is because, I was the co-editor on the online edition of those papers at University of Virginia. And one of the things that Ben Ray was having done was, every semester he would have students in his course who would be creating small biographies of players
Right.
in the trials. And so they're all posted up there. So that's actually all data that's, available already. I'm just like, Ben, I haven't talked to you in years. Let's talk. Because that's, because so much of that historiography has been, was it geographical, was it economic, blah, 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 all that. And this would probably really help to transform some of it. Or confirm, just like you were saying,
Right, the 80-20 rule.
the 80% that we already knew.
So one of the things I will say, and you saw it on the version that I gave you, is that I've given you space for geocodes and town codes. A lot of the development it also is a standardized JSON data set, so you can get it out and back in again. So you can get new data in. It doesn't have to be data that's created in NetCreate. It can come from external. And those three features were driven by either projects that I've been personally involved in or projects that I've seen other people that I know personally involved in. We need to be able to put network nodes on a map. There's some real value to that. We need to be able to play networks in time because we're historians, and if it's just sort of
Right.
sitting there, it doesn't do us as much good. Yeah, so one of the things we'd like to add is filtering so that we can filter by time code or citation or whatever so that you can play them.
I've just done separate ones, and then you look at them.
You can, but that's not
Just
ideal,
more work,
right?
yeah.
You want to be able to have it all there and hide or show, right?
Exactly, yeah.
That's what makes it approachable as opposed to the Gephi assumption that you're an expert. And we need this to be accessible to people who know what they're doing in the theory terms, but maybe necessarily don't have the willingness to push buttons and break stuff that makes Gephi approachable.
Hey, what's the relink edges to this node box?
So that's set up for, I've given you admin access to this.
Oh.
Students don't normally see that. And what that does, if two people put in Agrippina, I can, and then Agrippina has links, I can merge those
Okay.
nodes. So this gives us the option of deleting a node without relinking anything, or deleting it and relinking it as a merge function.
That's good.
So there were a few little things, and that came out of The first classroom trial we did in October of last year, about a year ago, with the first version of this, which I would not even say was alpha, but we had a classroom intervention, we had the tool, and we needed to figure out how students would use it. So there were a couple of sort of quasi-focus group learning interventions that sit halfway on the line between did we build software that works and how will the students use it. And then the one in the spring was the real key. Yeah?
I have a question. So I'm thinking about, I teach a social studies methods class. And so I can see this being ideal for me to help see students if they're making connections based upon class discussion that we have and whatnot. And what tends to happen is some students, they'll be thinking a thought, but they'll hear someone else say it, and then when I ask them specifically, they'll say, well, what you said. So how does this prevent well, someone already did that, what they said? How does that prevent, like how do they all jump in, even if someone else said it? You know what I mean?
So the great thing about network analysis for that exact problem is that network analysis is the aggregate of a whole bunch of individual interactions. If Agrippina and Claudius talk on page 2, and Agrippina and Claudius talk on page 3, those are 2 separate entries. You have to enter it. The instructions are that you treat those as 2 entries. So it forces people to participate. And then the patterns that the students begin to see become aggregated from all of those individual interactions. It privileges students who are less likely to speak up precisely because we've given them instructions to duplicate what other people did, provided that the citation page number is different and that the interaction is described differently. So even on page 3 of Claudius and Agrippina talk 4 times, that significance field says, this was this one time. Have you entered the next one? No, you have not. Go do that. That's part of what we're trying to get around is the engagement problem, where some students do and some students don't, and the students who don't and feel like their thunder has been stolen have the opportunity to pitch in and talk. Yes?
I'm thinking about the online discussions. I want to find out how students interact with each other, the patterns of, who had what, something like that. I'm thinking about this, that I just don't know if we already have the students' online discussions, how can we input into this and to show that kind of patterns?
So you could do hand entry and just say, this student responded to this student, copy and paste their quote. You could have them have the discussion that way, using the tool, so that they're, oh, this concept is here, this is the thing that the person has said about it, I have a new concept, I would like to add that, and I will link it to the original concept, and I will put my name in it in one of the fields that's provided. The fields are pretty open, you can use them for whatever you want. The other way is to scrape the data and put the data in as students responding to other students so that you can see who takes precedence in the network. The question is, though, at a deeper level, what is it that you're looking to see out of a visualization of your students' interactions? Is it that you need to give them a sense? Like you want to show them that graph so that they can see who they're interacting with, and so the people who are really big in the center, because they constantly post, feel like they should post less or more? I think that's the question to ask, because that would define how and what you want them to do.